everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Josh Hoff. I am a solid waste planner at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. In addition to that work, I volunteer on Build Reuse's membership and programming committee, coordinating webinar opportunities such as this one. So if you have a great time today, which I hope you all will, and you have important work that you'd like to share with the Build Reuse community, please feel free to send an email our way and we can get a webinar coordinated for you and you can share your amazing work. In addition to monthly webinar opportunities such as this one, we do have monthly brag webinar opportunities, which are a little less presentation focused and a little more small group conversation based. So that's just kind of a way to get together with people from around the country who are part of the Build Reuse community to really dig into specific issues and find solutions to any barriers that people are running into in their work to advance the circular economy. So really happy to be here today, helping host this webinar. We'll be monitoring any questions in the chat, so feel free to use that feature, as well as have a Q&A portion at the end that you can ask questions directly to our presenter today. So if I missed anything, Melissa, feel free to jump in, but thank you, Toria, for being here and sharing the work about your capstone. I had a chance to speak with Toria at the Build Reuse conference, and I was just blown away with the sheer quality of the thesis itself. Like from a marketing branding standpoint, everything was so well put together and the content is just really incredible. So really excited to be here and have Toria share that good work with you all. So thank you.
Um, do I start? Like, I'm sorry, I'm just not too sure what's going on, but
Yeah, this is
um,
casual enough where we can turn it over to you. If you have slides to share, you should be able to have that
perfect.
opportunity.
I do. I have slideshow. Let's do this one. All right. Can everybody see my screen? Just want to make sure everything's working properly. Awesome, thank you. Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Toria Lindenmouth, and I am a recent graduate from the University of Colorado at Boulder from the program of environmental design. And this is my undergraduate senior thesis project, which I titled Adaptive Reuse Assessment. So just to kind of do a little quick elevator pitch, essentially what I did was I went through a bunch of different adaptive reuse case studies, compared it with demolished buildings, see where those buildings overlap to see if any of these demolished buildings could be saved, what trends occurred, and what we could do to preserve them more often. So I'm going to go into a much more depth than hopefully what I presented at the Build Reuse conference. So if you have any questions, just feel free to ask away and I'll be glad to answer them. So the project topic is I wanted to understand the adaptive reuse policy in Denver, Colorado more thoroughly. And then I wanted to use that process to understand how architects make decisions on which buildings are adapted and what makes a building unable to be adapted. There are so many different decision-making processes and different qualities and questions that go into the adaptive reuse process. So I wanted to see if there was a way I could take all this information coming at me from one city and see if I can find a way to streamline it. So that's essentially one of the research questions I used. And the second one was I wanted to find the areas in adaptive reuse that limit architects the most to revise them to include more qualities, more quantities, more buildings, anything I can to just expand the circular economy within the city. So these were the specific research questions I used throughout my year researching. I asked what parameters and decision-making practices determine whether building typologies are feasible for adaptation or demolition, and how can the process of evaluating large-scale commercial buildings within Denver, Colorado be improved to promote adaptation rather than demolition, leading to more sustainable outcomes. Um, I want to kind of take a step back and explain kind of what inspired this thesis, because I'm sure people have similar experiences within their own city. But on the way up to CU Boulder, you take US 36, and there's definitely lots of towns, lots of buildings. And the one that stands out the most is this building called the First Bank Center, which is a big theater. It's used for shows, concerts, whatnot. And It was demolished earlier in 2024. And the thing that was very upsetting within the community and within the architecture construction sector itself was that this building was only 17 years old and they just demolished it. And about 90 something percent of demolition waste just goes straight to landfill and it doesn't get reused at all. So one of the reasons why I wanted to look into adaptive reuse was not only to preserve the buildings, but if the buildings can't be preserved in its original foundation, how can I use that material within other buildings? And so I found that very important and very something I wanted to research more thoroughly. So here are the research methods, and these are the steps I took to understanding adaptive reuse in Denver. To make it easier, I have this very large and complicated flow chart, but to simplify it, I had 5 different research methods that all provided a different analysis that I combined into what I created as this thesis. So we're gonna just go step by step over through each one of them, and we're gonna come out with one thorough conclusion. But the first thing I had to do is set up research parameters to set a baseline of what I am going to be researching, because without these parameters, there's just so much to look at within a building. So I had to limit it down, not only for sake of myself, but to be able to explain it more simply. So I basically use the literature that exists within the research itself as like a baseline. I used it to establish reoccurring themes, different things that were popping up that I can use to apply to every single part of my research. Then I found case studies within Denver of adaptive reuse projects that were very successful to analyze these parameters to find a trend line. And then I made that trend line into a building typology that was the most average adaptive reuse building within Denver. These were the 5 research parameters I ended up picking. I found that these were very important characteristics within the conversation of deciding which building is going to be picked for adaptation, and as well as deciding which building is going to be picked for demolition. So really, it's just the age of the building. So how old it was before when the building was constructed. That does not include anything of renovation or anything like that. It is strictly just from construction to today if it had not been demolished prior. So the building, i.e. the building was constructed in 1914. That is just when the building was constructed, and that is probably like 120 years. So that's the age. The characteristics, the different types of architectural styles. So Art Deco, Victorian brick detailing, things of that nature I analyzed in a more less quantifiable or way, in a more of like qualitative ways. So it was very subjective, but it was very important characteristics to be able to sort out different types of buildings to see if regionally they made a difference. Location, with what type of neighborhood. Was it a historic neighborhood? Is it an industrial neighborhood? That was very important. The size of the building, the square footage. Is it a smaller building that usually tends to get adapted, or is it a larger building? That is something I looked into. And then what was the building currently used as? So if it is an office building, high density apartments or residential, is it something like a warehouse? I looked into that. And here is the data analysis table that I used. I know it looks like a lot, but really it's just all as much information I could find on about 94 different case studies within Colorado, within the US. It was a lot of work, but it was very satisfying to actually find all of these. But I kind of had to find if what the age of the building was, what the characteristics were, and I used all of that to create the analysis. So I'm going to be going through a bunch of tables and kind of explaining my findings through that. And then at the end, I'm going to explain the typology of case studies in Denver. And that's what I used as like a baseline. So this table kind of represents the average year built of the age of the building, more like. So as you can see, there is a large quantity of buildings constructed within the early 1900s, between the 1900s and the 1950s. So a lot of the buildings tend to be on the older side as they are adapted. A lot of it was very rare. A few outliers happened when the buildings were built prior to the 1800s or after the 2000s. So you kind of found a large range of buildings between the 20th century and the mid of the century. This is a different view, but I use this essentially to get the median of the year constructed. 1914 was, or 1914, 1950 was around the average year of construction for adaptive reuse buildings within Denver. And this was over 78 different projects. So I figured that would be a pretty generalized age given the number of projects, but they're on the older side, which I found very fascinating. And perhaps maybe if we figured out how to use some of these newer buildings, those could be included in adaptive reuse within the city. Here is a chart of the different percentages of the different architectural styles. And this particularly kind of fits within the age of construction because most of the buildings and architectural style was a historic brick structure, which makes sense. Most of the buildings built in that time were made of brick rather than sheet metal like in a warehouse or stucco for any other type of different style. But historic brick structure was the highest, and then industrial warehouse in mid-century were following that at 10% each, which was kind of fascinating. I figured the warehouses would be a little bit more of the adaptive reuse projects rather than historic brick structures. And here is a map of the building location. For those of you who don't really know the Denver area too well, the highlighted areas are within the downtown city sector, and the rest are surrounding suburban areas, as well as including the international airport. But most, if not all, of the projects were within the historic neighborhoods in Denver. So this big little square that's kind of over here, that one is called the Five Points neighborhood, and that is a historic neighborhood. And then the one neighboring it right there, that small one, that is the Union Station neighborhood or lower downtown, and that is where our big train station is and a lot of our old historic buildings. So it definitely fits with a lot of the trends we have been seeing of older buildings and brick constructions being built and reused, because those are the areas where it would happen. This is a pie chart of the different sizes. We found out that large buildings, which is 50,000 square feet or above, were a majority of the size for adapted reuse buildings. There was no definite like conclusion on if this is including any additions or if this is strictly just the original building. But regardless, 50,000 square feet is the majority in adaptive reuse projects within Denver. But it is following closely by smaller and medium buildings, but it is just the size of the building right there that is shown. And then here is the building use. A lot of buildings that are adapted, so these are what the current use of the building it was before it was adapted into something else. It was split evenly between warehouse, commercial office buildings, and educational buildings, so like old schools or stuff like that. Which makes sense because these are large footprints able to be adapted and used into many different facilities, and they're not very strict in a kind of niche footprint. So it leaves a lot of opportunities for importing anything you want within these spaces. So that's very on brand for adaptive reuse within the city. And then this is the typology trends within the city. So like I said before, 1914 was the building age, the building characteristics with historic brick structures. Union Station was the most common neighborhood in Denver with adaptive reuse buildings, large buildings, warehouse, commercial office buildings. So that was our typology, and that is our baseline for adaptive reuse buildings in Denver. And next this is the next part of the research. We went into demolition permits. We basically applied those 5 parameters into permits over the last 10 years to see which buildings kind of overlapped. So what I did was I acquired a bunch of data between 2014 and 2024. I narrowed those permits down from strictly anything to just commercial buildings. I didn't want any residential. And I also wanted buildings that had complete demolition. So that means nothing of the original structure was remaining. It was just the site. So some of the permits included just partial demolitions. I wanted to get rid of as many of those as possible. So this is how I narrowed that scope. I started out with almost 6,000 permits, which was a lot. And then I was able to narrow it down to 636 because any building over $20,000 with a valuation of over $20,000 would be considered a commercial building rather than a house or a single family residence. This was recommended by the city it's themselves. So that is how I was able to get that number. And then 238 was how many complete demolitions were out of the 636. And I ended up getting to about 170 of those 238 permits. And this is another example of a data table, definitely a lot of information, but we're going to go over all of this as we go through. So starting off with the year, we found that buildings built around the early 1950s, mid 1950s were most likely to be demolished. But as you can see, there are definitely some outliers at the bottom. So that means some older buildings were demolished, and closer to the top, so buildings closer to 220 years or less were demolished as well. So that is definitely not something we like to see, the new buildings being demolished and the old buildings being demolished. Buildings have generally a lifespan of about 50 years before they reach their end of life cycle. So seeing those buildings from the early 90s, late 90s to the 2000s being demolished is definitely a little bit of a heart hurting moment. But I was able to separate most of these buildings by their decade to find the general percentage. So yeah, between 60 and 69 years old was the highest percentage of demolitions. And it just definitely varies between that, but 15% would be the second highest, which was also 40 to 49 years of age and 20 to 29 years of age. Here is a pie chart kind of demonstrating how many buildings that were less than 30 before they were demolished out of all 100 and something permits I analyzed. Here is the map of Denver. And if we remember our little geography lesson from earlier, the historic 5 Points neighborhood is the highest concentration of demolitions within Denver. So there's a huge overlap between these old historic buildings and buildings in that neighborhood that were saved through adaptive reuse, and the buildings that were demolished within that neighborhood that could have been saved for adaptive reuse. The building area, a lot of the buildings before demolition were small, less than 15,000 square feet. So that was fairly surprising, considering we like to save the larger buildings, but there's always opportunities for additions or anything to increase that square footage to kind of meet that trend line. And then the building size after demolition, I also analyzed the buildings if they were reconstructed, what that square footage was. And you can see that large buildings, the difference between large buildings then before demolition and after demolition has significantly increased. So we're definitely looking for a higher square footage of building using those plots of demolished buildings. So yeah, definitely a big a comparison between the two. The large buildings jumped from 8% to 30%, so it's a huge jump. The building use was definitely my most interesting, like the thing I was most interested about in the demolished buildings. And I kind of want to point out the vacant land. Um, there were 10% of buildings that were kind of not even there. They were just kind of like maybe a shed, mostly land. And that jumped from 10% to 23% after the demolition. So a lot of the buildings in these lots that were demolished had not been rebuilt, and they were used as vacant land, perhaps parking. These buildings weren't being used for anything. Another thing to take note of is that office buildings, those were primarily demolished at 21%. So we see a lot of different people fighting for policy to use office buildings and turning those into apartment buildings, um, especially with COVID and the work from home, like people moving to work from home rather than going back into the office. And instead of doing something like that, where we take that building footprint, we're demolishing these office buildings and still erecting more office buildings because there's still some after demolition. So yeah, the collective building typology was small office buildings in 1954 in the Five Points neighborhood or the most likely building to be demolished, but those were the trends that I noticed from these demolition permits. The next step I took was I used Google imaging to find the before, during, and after of each of these permits to define those changes that I noted before in these demolished buildings. It was a content analysis mostly for building height and the visual analysis for recurring trends, just to see if the trends from the buildings before kind of matched the trends of the building after, to see if like was it completely necessary to destroy that building, or was it an older building that was being updated. That is what I did with these archived global imaging analysis. So this is kind of like an example. So with the way that Google Street View works is that every so often a car goes by and takes imaging, and it happens every couple years or so. Sometimes there will be a gap in time when the streetcar misses the demolition or it misses the construction. And so sometimes I only have a before and after, like seen in this top row. And sometimes I will be able to see every single step of this construction. So like this row, second from bottom, you can see that there's the building before. There is a soil lot, which is during the construction, as you can tell, and or during the demolition during the construction, and then the building after. And usually there's kind of a difference, and sometimes there's not a difference, and sometimes it gets turned into a road. Sometimes you can't tell what the difference is. So that is what the purpose of the archival imaging research analysis was. So yeah, this is the comparison between the building height before and the building height after. There are some instances where the building height has decreased significantly in height. So like over by 71, 76, the building height before was about 150 feet tall, and it dropped down to about 50 feet instead of creating a taller building like you would think. Um, there are also some instances where it goes completely flat, and that is part of the vacant land use that I mentioned earlier. It's definitely a big bummer. But here is the comparison. So this is the difference in height before and after demolition. So some of them have decreased more than 100 feet, and some of them have gone up in height by about 300. So there's definitely a large range, but there is a difference between the buildings before and the buildings after. And it could show that maybe we could take some of these smaller, older buildings and just add on to them if that's what we're needing. We're needing buildings, but we could just keep the existing footprint if that is something that is possible, or just use that existing material within the new construction. So yeah, this is a similar map or similar pie chart where I kind of took the percent of buildings that had a decrease in height after reconstruction and showed the overall percentage of that from the difference in height. And so 26 of the percent of the buildings decreased in height, which is very interesting. These are some graphics I made to kind of show some of the statistics regarding some of these deconstructions and reconstructions. So like here's a statistics, 275% increase in new large buildings after demolishing the existing building. So in 3501 Wazee Street, there was this little tiny building during the demolition and during the construction, and the after building is much taller, it's much larger. Here's another one. This building was pretty new despite its look. It was built in the 90s, was demolished and was replaced with a larger building. Here was a building that remained vacant after it was demolished. Nothing has been done with this lot in I think over 5 years, which is definitely a bummer. And the building height. So you can see the increase in height after reconstruction. So yeah, 23. These are a bunch of the statistics that I just showed to you. So definitely summarized right here. My fourth research method was to interview some architects. One of my research questions was to find out what policies within the my God, I'm blanking. I'm so sorry. The adaptive reuse policy limits architects. And the only way to do that was to get their firsthand account of that. So what I did was I conducted 30-minute professional interviews to figure out their own philosophy on adaptive reuse, their own project decisions to also gain insight on what some of the decision-making processes they picked were, and to identify policy strengths and weaknesses to see what areas I can target to make the framework assistance more beneficial. So these were some of the research questions that I prepared based off of, or the interview questions I prepared based off of the research questions. So each of the 5 or so questions and sub-questions directly relate to these research questions. It was my way of getting the most beneficial information within such a short period of time. And here are some of the answers from the questions I asked. So if we go back, question 1, could you describe your thought process for any decisions made throughout the adaptive reuse projects in Denver? Question 2, can you explain any factors that decide which direction a project went? Question 3, could you describe your experiences with adaptive reuse projects in Denver? Question 4, could you describe any issues or challenges you found with the current adaptive reuse policy in Denver? And question 5, could you describe any sustainability related decisions you made regarding any adaptive reuse projects? And some of the answers were keeping the structure and the character of the building is important in preserving culture and for further decision making. This is seen in some of the projects they showed me where they kind of kept some of the charm of the building. If it had unique structural standpoint, they used that or structure within the building that is not really seen in newer buildings. They kept that and made it a focal point of the design rather than demolishing that and finding new modern ways of adding structure. Question 2 was mostly about economics and maintenance of the existing building. It's mostly why they demolished buildings, the primary factor. It's definitely a strong contender for why we need more stipends and more resources for people who want to go into a more sustainable building method rather than completely destroying a building, if economics is one of those reasons. Question 3 is working around the existing structure was the most common experience for adopting existing buildings. So this means it's like what they do is they don't really demolish as much of the building. They kind of keep the existing walls, the existing windows, the existing floor plan, and just kind of work around as much as they can without using that so they don't have to tear down and throw away the materials because sometimes it's just not as reusable as you think it is. Question 4 is issues with getting approval from the city for aspects like zoning, landmark preservation, and making changes to historic structures are commonly occurring during adaptive reuse projects. It makes sense considering how difficult it is to get historic preservation or landmark preservation status. It does come with some credits and some funding as well to be able to have your own structure be preserved as a landmark preservation or historic structure. So that is definitely a struggle, especially considering the trend of buildings is from the early 1900s, considering they would make it into landmark preservation status. And question 5 was responsibly sourcing materials from local areas, impact project costs, and release carbon emissions. So that is definitely one way that most of them have described being a sustainable effort within adaptive reuse projects. So this is the last method, which is taking everything that I have learned from these past 4 research methods and applying it to an existing building in Denver, to see what my own take on adaptive reuse would be. So this was the proposed building. It's a very gorgeous older structure in the Union Station area, close to 5 Points within downtown Denver. It has the historic brick structure, and it is currently used as an office building. So it overlaps between both the adaptive reuse typology and the demolished building typology. So these are more images. So we have a back courtyard. This is the existing staircase within the building that has been around for a while. And then this is the side and some of the original lettering from when this was used as like a storage facility for when Denver was a huge train hub. So yeah, this is a comparison between the case study trends, the demolition chalking tool trends, and the selected building characteristics. It overlaps with a bunch of all of these buildings, and it made it a pretty decent contender for a adaptive reuse project within the city. So I'm going to go through a bunch of floor plans. I'm kind of going to zoom past it just so we can have some time for questions. But each floor plan has this is an overlap of the existing floor plan with the proposed floor plan to show what of the existing structure is being preserved, what is being built within the new structure, and what is being removed. So the less brown you see, the better it is, because that is the stuff that is being removed. The blue is what is being kept, and the red is what is being added. So this is the existing basement. This is the first floor, so you can see some walls are definitely being removed, but most of the structure is being kept, is remaining. Here's the second floor. It is shown as a lot of additions, not nearly as much demolition as you would like as normal renovations, normal buildings would be. That's my goal, was to try and preserve as much of the building as possible. The third floor is essentially the same thing. So what I did with this building, I turned it into a little boutique hotel. It holds about 50 guest rooms that has amenities like a gym, a underground bar to kind of match within Denver's historic speakeasy era. It is within prime location for this to be beneficial for the community because it is very close to a lot of very popular event sites like concert venues, as well as the Coors Field baseball field. And I wanted to keep it because it's also within a lot of restaurants and very fun social areas within Denver. So it's definitely a more beneficial use than offices, considering, like I said, the work from home movement. So the basement was turned into a bar, gym, storage, and a lot of administration. The first floor is the lobby and lounge. There's a public restaurant within the first floor, and an event space, and as well as employee spacing. And here is the second floor. There is definitely a large variety of rooms, including suites, doubles, singles, and very small rooms for people who just want to spend a night. I struggled within the middle because there was a large open space, but what I ended up doing was I integrated an art gallery and a lounge seating so that local artists can display their work and it could provide more to Denver's culture and our own history within the city. Then the third floor is just more rooms and more proposed art seating. And then here is the exploded programs just to show the separation between spaces and what the proposed building kind of looks like overall. And we're on to our final findings. So it definitely shows that characteristics in building typology trends found in adaptive reuse projects were just large old warehouses within the Union Station neighborhood and historic brick structures were like most likely to be adapted. So kind of going with beyond that characteristics and trying to integrate more newer buildings, more like different characteristics to include more buildings within our built sector is definitely something that we can strive for as a city. The characteristics and building typology trends found in the demolition projects. And we're finding that more mid-century buildings were being demolished within the Five Points neighborhood. They're smaller office buildings. So maybe using those buildings and building additions onto them, using those buildings and deconstructing them instead of completely demolishing them because the wood, some of the materials might still be reusable. We found that the most upsetting statistic was the 23% of building parcels remained vacant after demolition. And we established the demolition tracking tool, which was this comparison of these trends so that it can be used to kind of as a explanation, as a kind of something to use during the questioning stage with a developer to see, well, this is the buildings that are being demolished usually, these are the buildings that are being preserved, like your building has characteristics from both, why don't we try adapting it, used as kind of like a argument to help preserve the building for your selected building, like what I did in my example. And I use the expert interviews to find out different ways to help preserve the buildings, to find weaknesses in the structures and or in the policy. And then I used the DTT to propose a design, and that was what we just saw. So thank you so much for listening. If you have any more questions after the Q&A, just feel free to shoot me an email or connect with me on LinkedIn. I will be able to answer any questions that you would like. And if you want to be able to read this thesis, I have a digital copy of it. And if you just scan this QR code, you will have access to that through Google Drive. So yeah, just make a copy of it, do whatever you would like with it. But that is my research. So thank you so much for listening, you guys.
Scanning QR code now. That was wonderful. I mean, really depressing.
It's a little bummer. It's a little bit of a bummer, yeah.
Okay, we need to know what reality is, and this is reality, and this is probably, any medium to large town USA.
Right. I'm taking it as more of like of an encouragement. Just like we see all these buildings being demolished. This is what we can do to preserve the buildings. Yeah, this is what we should be looking for.
Right on. Well, I did have a question. I guess as the person who wrote one in chat, maybe I get privilege. So just towards the end of what you're saying, talking about, I understand that buildings need to come down in some cases. I may disagree why, but or that it needed to come down. But were you able to find out why buildings were destroyed and not replaced?
Within the permits, there was no official explanation. There were some that had some explanations. It was very rare if there was any, but there was some where it was like the structural components of the building were compromised through things like fire, wear and tear. but mostly I would assume it's an economic standpoint. The buildings are too expensive to remain as they are, and by completely demolishing them and rebuilding them with more sustainable systems is definitely something that developers are looking for to help cut back on costs.
Got it.
Mhm.
Are you familiar with the concept of land value tax by chance?
Um, I have not. I'm very new into
That,
this considering
that's
I just
okay.
graduated.
I learned about it 2 years ago and I'm 47. So, and I've kind of been in this world for a little while. It's a concept where the land itself and the building on it is taxed as if it had a valuable purpose so
Mhm,
that people don't sit on empty lots or empty vacant buildings. And
mhm,
so it requires usually an ordinance change, usually oftentimes requires a state law change to allow cities to be able to do this. We're working on it here in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And it's meant to provide the same tax structure as if a building was there. And I
mhm.
don't know the details, like what kind of building, to what capacity, a skyrise or a single family home. I don't really know those details, but I do know that there's a lot of properties, again, in big cities and small towns alike, where land is vacant, hoping for the next big break, or
Mhm.
just waiting and sitting on it. And especially in downtown Denver, downtown Minneapolis, St. Paul, that land is very valuable and it's doing nothing. So I
Yeah.
don't, just a food for thought. It's like I said, it's a newer concept for me, but vacant land in the city of Denver just seems so wrong,
Yeah,
right?
it does, especially considering we have such strong density in a lot of the neighborhoods where I mentioned there's a lot of demolition is where it's in the heart of the downtown area. That's
Mhm.
where the land is much more valuable because we
Right,
can't expand out. So I
right.
I wish if I'll look into see if Denver has that tax land because
Sure.
I really hope they do so we don't have examples of vacant lots sitting for 5+ years doing absolutely nothing.
It's not as novel as it sounds, and yet it's still taking time for folks to embrace it, especially at the state level and in individual cities. So we
Absolutely.
fought for it this legislative session and lost. But we're getting momentum because there were people that never heard about it in this legislative session. So,
Mhm.
progress every year.
Yeah.
Every fight is a fight.
Yeah. Exactly.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I really loved the kind of redesign into the boutique hotel, and I particularly appreciate kind of your creative use of that huge kind of space and making it an art gallery for kind of connection to the community of Denver. So I guess I'm just curious in kind of all of your research, if you perhaps in like the informational interviews, if you got a sense of how community input guides adaptive reuse at all. Is there like a strong kind of trend in which these developers are seeing people asking for specific things in these properties? Um, Anything that you kind of went into would be helpful. But I
Yeah.
just really appreciated the concept of having a very interesting hotel stay. I
Mhm.
can't list the amount of times that I've, stayed in a hotel. Like this could be a lot cooler. So I just thought, it's so amazing to see creative uses of existing buildings, especially the way that you propose here.
Thank you. No, absolutely. The interviews were definitely a large inspiration behind the cultural impacts between the designs. Um, a lot of what they talked about was just using the surrounding areas and the surrounding community as like inspiration for their own design. And a lot of adaptive reuse buildings tend to do that. So one of the examples I remember reading about was it was like a restaurant that was once a old fire station, and there is lots of different homages to that old prior use of the building because it was once a very important part of the community and people just don't like to see that go away. Within my own neighborhood, actually, we used to have an airport like manufacturing hangar because my neighborhood used to be the old international airport before the Denver International Airport moved in, and so we have a lot of plane themed stuff. But this old airplane manufacturing hangar is now turned into like a shopping center. It's like got a lot of like very local malls and very local stuff that definitely encourages community engagement because and being able to do stuff with the old historic buildings without getting rid of the building itself is definitely just like one part of it. It's just don't get rid of the things that were super important for the community, and the community will fight for it if they see the good change in it, and it's definitely shown within those couple of examples I just gave. Mhm.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And it looks like we have another question in the chat from Doug. Yes, how are historical preservation codes going to be combined with deconstruction and demo?
So just like I'm guessing I'm asking a little clarification. Are we kind of talking about like landmark preservation and the demolition, or I and or just like generally historic older buildings and demolition? Because within Denver, like only landmark, you have to apply for landmark preservation, and that's like one of the things I mentioned being fairly difficult to do within the city, because there's a lot of like maintenance that goes with it. It's a lot of city administration, and as we heard before, it's really hard to hear back from the city. So it's very hard to get your building labeled as a landmark to be able to preserve it. And demolition doesn't really discriminate between an old building or a new building. If it's a building that someone will pay to demolish, it's getting demolished, unfortunately. And that's kind of the brutal reality of the situation, and why I want to create this demolition tracking tool to try and preserve these characters, these buildings with strong character. So I'm sorry if that didn't answer your question.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to throw in the chat, or please feel free to come off mute if you have one as well.
Yes, please.
Hey, Toria, I've got one for you. This is Lauren at City of Portland. One thing I would love to see is your analysis at a couple of different time points. So, for example, we were able to get our deconstruction ordinance going during a period of like a total boom in development in the mid-teens. And there were perfectly good houses coming down through demolition instead of deconstruction, because there was a great opportunity to build newer, bigger things and make a lot of money off of it. Now we're in the exact opposite cycle: high interest rate, low development. And so the types of houses we see in our demolition permits are totally different. And it's a lot more of like our smallest, junkiest, most damaged houses that are on a decent sized lot are coming down. And then thanks to our residential infill uh, loosening of restrictions to promote housing development, then they're becoming, maybe 4 units on a lot, which is great. But all that to say, there's this huge difference between what we see in a high development cycle and a low development cycle. And so I'm curious if you have any insights on things you saw in Denver, either in the neighborhood or in the time or the size or even orientation on a lot, I'm sure is a factor. If it's a smaller building in one corner versus if it was centered on the lot, those types of things.
So my period of demolition permits was from 2014 to 2024, which does cover a large area of time within Denver. It's fairly fascinating actually, because I've lived here my entire life, so I was able to see a lot of the buildings I recognized within these demolition permits. So to we don't within the areas that I was kind of looking, um there are slow points, but they're not as low as like it kind of completely changes typology. Once it gets into the suburbs, that's when it definitely changes. But downtown Denver is generally like we want to get rid of these smaller buildings to make way for larger, higher density buildings, because that is like the hub where people want to work and live. Within the suburbs, definitely within my own working experience, I'm seeing a lot less demolition nowadays within the 2020s, and more renovation and less demolition in general. So I'm kind of taking that as a little bit of a win. So in the suburbs, it's definitely a lot different than in the city. In my future research, I definitely want to be able to kind of broaden the scope. And that is a good thing I should be keeping in mind for different periods of time within different cities, just to see if that affects any of the typologies, because I've never really considered that before now. But definitely kind of explains why there's a wide arc between building ages and building characteristics. For sure. I have the chat open and I see that Kay asked if any vacant lots turned into gardens. Um, Currently, I don't know of any vacant lots that turned into gardens or any community gardens. I know of some demolition plots that had a building that got turned into landscaping in an overall campus, or got turned into a park. So I would not say curated garden, but it's definitely part of a landscaping, which is definitely really cool.
Not that I was part of Toria's studies, but here in St. Paul, Minnesota, there was a park that just, it's going to have its grand opening. It just had its ribbon cutting, so I think it's having its grand opening in about a couple days, and was an old luggage retail. I can't remember if it was manufacturing as well. The owner of that building and the company sold or donated the land to the city with the promise that it would be turned into a park, and it was a temporary park until enough funding was secured.
That's lovely.
So it was a vacant lot for a while, and it was a pop-up park. Annuals planted and benches and stuff like that. But I get to see it this Sunday. I mean, I can see it before, but I'm officially going to an event on Sunday at this park.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Love to see more of that. I would love to see more these vacant lots be turned into something useful instead of just another parking structure or a parking lot for an adjoining building. Would love to see that more.
Cool.
Yeah, feel free to ask any more questions if they pop up. But thank you so much for the opportunity. It was lovely to speak.
So I see that through the QR code or some other means that I have your document, your research paper, and we'll have this recording. Are you willing to share your slides with us?
Of course.
Okay.
I will email them to either yourself or Josh.
Yeah, that'd be great. And if a PDF makes it smaller, easier, we have a 25 megabyte limit, so it's pretty generous.
I think I might just put it in a zip and put it in the folder with the research. That might be the easiest way to do it.
That'd be great. Looks like we got a good question from Mackenzie. Does Denver have a demolition delay ordinance and program?
I've never heard of one. I don't exactly know what that is. From what I understand and from working with a general contractor, it's just you send for a permit, you get one, you get demolished a building. It's definitely something I can look into a little bit more, because it sounds very good to delay a demolition.
I can speak to it a little bit. and I'm actually going to Denver in a month for work. So I'm working with the city and county of Denver through my day job. I'm also a city council member, as well as in my day job working with local government. So I'm always curious at like how local governments are maneuvering in this space. And so demolition delay, in a very brief nutshell, is when any building permit is, or when anyone wants to demolish a building, their permit to demolish is delayed by a certain amount of time so that the city can assess whether it is appropriate to demo, or if it should be deconstructed, or if it should be moved, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a tool not to necessarily make it impossible to demolish, but just to make sure that the city can determine if the building is something worth keeping for many, many reasons. So it can be used in combination with historic preservation, and it doesn't have to be something that's designated necessarily. So I feel like I'm seeing those sorts of tools pop up in cities that have deconstruction ordinances, or like have like robust C&D recycling programs. But I'm very curious about demolition delay. I'm in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and we're looking at that ordinance as well because we're seeing so many permits start to come in, given we have not a ton of land, and there's always that development pressure, but we don't want to be throwing away buildings that have plenty of life left. So it's just one tool. It was curious if Denver had an existing one.
Megan kind of answered that question. She gave a link
Oh,
to
excellent.
a deconstruction ordinance. So it definitely goes into parts of the demolition plan where you separate a lot of the material for it to be recycled, which is very good. This was voted on in November of 2022, and they're still working. And they said it should occur in late summer 2025. So, hopefully that's actually something that's being implemented and observed within our new constructions. Actually, that's very good news. But as of for like the demolition delay, still don't know about it, but we should be, as we're moving forward, and as a lot of people are kind of struggling with construction, giving a lot of recent administration implementations like tariffs and rising costs of construction. I'm seeing a lot of ordinances and cities kind of create these policies to kind of preserve what we have, so we don't have to spend nearly as much on construction. So hope to see more things like a demolition delay ordinance within Denver soon.
Well, we are just about out of time, so please join me in sharing either a verbal reaction or an emoji that, yeah, me too, Mackenzie. And that makes sense for La Crosse too. I've been there several times and understand how
it's happening. It's happening.
Good. So again, for those that are, let me also put my reaction in. And how do folks make the one heart make fireworks hearts? I only get a single heart. You deserve the fireworks of hearts. Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're happy to be able to share this with somebody. Send with effect. I'll look into that. Thank you. We'll be sharing this out with the 93 people that registered and others that might be interested. So we throw every recording onto YouTube, so folks, whether or not they recorded or registered, can see the recording.
God, that's awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I really appreciated the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thanks all.
Doing good work.
Thank you.